When I step back and I look at this thing, we usually think of the business and the government as sort of emerging in a new set of relationships within China, Brazil, India, countries like that, where big business is arising more or less independently of government for the first time in history. The point I want to start off with is that we're seeing an evolution of the large corporation and its relationship to society and to the state, to the government, also in the advanced capitalist nations like Japan, the United States, and in Western Europe, and in particular Germany. You can think of Volkswagen, it used to be a company built for European scale and the European markets. Now it's really built for global scale. From the German government point of view, and most of the institutions in Germany, not all of it, I think they're going to look at this from the point of view of really wanting to not use a bunch of really stupid management decisions to break up what is a highly successful enterprise. It's highly successful not only in a profitability sense, but in the sense of a much broader being a symbol of the whole German economic miracle of the past 10 years. Because Germany feels that it's probably the most successful country in the world in adapting to global scale industries, not just in a business sense, but also in a political sense. Not looking at it from the German government point of view, but from Volkswagen's point of view. What can they learn? What can you learn as management students? I think the main thing I would take away from this is a very important lesson that the problem here is not poor risk management. It's the absence of risk management. Very few people inside Volkswagen knew about this decision. And what it suggests to me is a need for more emphasis on integrating risk management into your corporate strategy, where you can have some possibility of assessing the consequences for the brand, for crackdowns by your own host government and foreign governments, as the United States government is, and EPA and probably the Department of Justice are certainly going to do.
The issue for VW, it's a very interesting issue. As Paul said, it's a global company. It would like to be number one in the world in producing autos. Toyota is number one. There's no way, I don't think, VW can be number one in the world if they're getting about 2% of the market share in the US. And that's been their continued problem. And they have had for a long time this notion that a clean diesel engine would be something we'd all flock to. Now, they don't realize that we all drive either Subaru SUVs or pickup trucks. And Americans really don't care much about diesel. And there's a lot of bad history about diesel engines. So they were in a large market in which they have a minuscule share. And they, back in 06-07, projected to increase that share by selling up to 1 million vehicles a year. And so they came out with this engine with the defeat device. And here we are today, thanks to the California Air Resources Board, West Virginia, as you mentioned earlier, and California Air Resources Board, and the EPA. And they're facing this problem of repairing these. And just in the US, 482,000 vehicles. Horn last week in Congress said it would take 10 hours of work per vehicle, hardware and software involved. That works out to 5 million hours of labor just on the American part of this, not the 11 million, just the 482,000. Now, any of you who have had a VW and you've tried to get it serviced in a reasonable amount of time, it's not going to happen, especially if they're dealing with that. So that's a big issue, I think. But the real issue for VW, it seems to me, is in the European market. Because in the European market, VW is by far the number one company. If you take the auto group as a whole, including Audi and other vehicles, other lines, They have a little over 25% of the market share, more than twice PSA, which is the second most important. And in the European market, well over majority of all vehicles are diesel vehicles, in the range of 60 to 65% in France, in Belgium, in Italy, in Spain, about 50% in the UK and Germany. This is a huge market, and what makes this especially interesting and complicated for VW is that the Europeans, in particular the EU, have set up standards that are quite difficult. They're not as difficult as the EPA's, but they are moving in that direction. And the real problem for VW, it seems to me, beyond all the lawsuits, the class action suits of customers, the fraud issue, the repair issue, the real question for me is what happens in that market where they are dominant or at least have the largest share. And if they can't retain that share, they will have a serious problem.
What I'm particularly interested in my research and also in my teaching is what political scientists talk about as global governance. You know, who sets the rules governing the world? And the particularly interesting challenge there for companies is that companies, of course, are increasingly global. They're spanning countries in terms of their supply chains, their distribution networks, and so on. But most political authority remains vested in nation states that control a piece of territory. And there's a subplot here to this story that is so interesting, and it has to do with climate change and how different parts of the world have decided to tackle that issue. So part of the reason why Volkswagen and many of the other European manufacturers have such a large share in the European market with their diesel engines and why they're virtually absent from the US is just a matter of policy. That fiscal policy and other types of regulations gave incentives to people in Europe to buy diesel cars, and in the US that wasn't the case. And it had to do with the way different parts of the world tried to tackle climate change. So it actually turns out just as important as Volkswagen is for Wolfsburg and Lower Saxony and the German economy, this focus on these very efficient in terms of fuel consumption, small turbo diesels was a key piece of the way the German government and through it the European Union decided to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. People wanted to have torque, they wanted to have power in their cars, and as long as they had that, they were okay, of course, with lower emissions because it actually meant less gas consumption and it saved some money on the pump, and diesel seemed to be delivering all of that. In the US, people had been more skeptical, in part because of prior experiences with diesel, a couple of other reasons, and so a lingering issue, particularly between the German government and the US government, but more broadly between the EU and the US, has been about emissions requirements for diesel. And sort of simple trade-off is that diesel means more particles but less CO2. And in the US, the focus was on strict limits on particles, whereas in the EU, the focus was on strict limits on CO2. And in fact, the German government has continuously lobbied the US government to actually relax its standards around particles. So the interesting thing here, of course, is that as a global company, you're now sort of dealing with different regulation in different parts of the world. Volkswagen thought that US regulations were too strict. That's a view that they can have. They can advocate for that view. Of course, what you shouldn't be doing is develop a defeat device to just say, we don't like your regulations, we're going to figure out a way to circumvent it, which is what they did. So this is, in a way, a symptom of what happens when companies are working globally in a world where regulation is quite fragmented. And I think as we learn to what extent German and European authorities were at least aware of or didn't look as closely as they should have, there's some interesting transatlantic political dimensions to this right before the climate summit in Paris that is coming up later this year. The last comment I'll make is, as we're looking at how Volkswagen is dealing with this, I'm struck by how regional their crisis management seems to be. Just to give you one data point, if you go to the Volkswagen USA website, the first thing you see on the top is click here for information about the emissions scandal. If you click there, you see a separate website, I think it's called vwdiesel.com, with the CEO apologizing, and an FAQ list along the lines of what do I do with my car and when do I get it fixed. Nowhere on the Volkswagen USA website will you see any reference to diesel models, even the ones that are still licensed to be sold. You go to the German website and it's business as usual. There's no reference to the emissions scandal. The same cars are being sold as before. The TDI models are an important part of it. And if you read the German press, you really get the sense that the people at Volkswagen who believe that they can somehow ring-fence this and sort of deal with the issue in the US and get some help from from the German government in keeping the bill down. I think this is a much bigger issue. As Professor Cameron said, it goes to the heart of Volkswagen's global strategy. It goes to the heart of how Europeans have tried to achieve lower emissions without sacrificing performance and their cars, which has been one way of getting European business behind an aggressive climate change agenda, because supposedly we're able to have it all. So I think we're still at the very, very beginning of a story that is going to have, shock waves throughout, the year on multiple domains.